Scientific misconduct. Identifying and reporting misconduct is everyone's responsibility. So anyone that works in clinical research or in any type of research, whether you're at a site, whether you're at a sponsor, whether you're at a regulatory authority, a university, or wherever, we all need to be aware of scientific misconduct and how to recognize it, what it is, and the danger that it poses. Our learning objectives for scientific misconduct are to identify the types of misconduct, to find the difference between misconduct and fraud, and then finally understand how to recognize and respond to potential misconduct. So the first type of misconduct is fraud. Now, all of you are familiar with what that is. It's an intentional deception made for some type of personal gain. For example, one might intentionally classifying or fabricating research data or misleading the reporting of results. We tend to think of fraud where someone's being defrauded on some sort of financial basis, but the important thing to understand is that it has to be an intentional deception that's made for some type of personal gain. The next category of misconduct or scientific misconduct is misconduct itself. So it may not be intentional. It also includes a failure to follow established protocol if the failure causes harm to patients. And this may be something that you'll see more routinely in a clinical trial. So it's important to be aware of what that is. The categories of scientific misconduct include fabrication, which is making up experiments, making up data. Also, falsification, which is going to include changing results, data without statistical justification. Then we have plagiarism, appropriating the words or ideas of another and presenting them as one's own. Many of you are probably familiar with what plagiarism is. And then finally, we have ghostwriting. Ghostwriting refers to the authoring of papers for others, and these can be done either in maybe an academic setting, or a lot of times it's done in a professional setting, but it is an example of scientific misconduct, and we need to be aware of it. So let's take a look at fraud. How do we pick up on fraud? Okay, first of all, we understood that fraud is an intentional act of deception for personal gain. So a few signs to look for as it pertains to clinical data. A couple things you might see. You might see perfect visit attendance by all the patients, which is very, very unusual. And if you see that, it's probably an indication that that data may be false. You may see duplicate data, such as lab results. If a patient comes in and they've got a lab result from one visit, and then they come in for the following visit that might be a few weeks later, a month later, and they've got identical lab results, that may be an indication that something is something wrong there in the lab. It doesn't mean it's fraud, but that might be something we want to at least take a look at. 100% drug compliance. This is one that every trial would love to have 100% drug compliance, but you're not going to have that because patients aren't going to take all of the drug on the schedule according to the schedule. So there's probably going to be some deviations from that. You're never going to have 100% drug compliance. Finally, you've got no adverse events are reported and no concomitant medications are reported. That's very unusual because, as we know, an adverse event is anything from a headache to a heart attack. So more than likely over the course of a trial, depending on even for a very short trial, a patient is going to experience some type of adverse event. That's pretty common. And they're going to have some concomitant medications that are reported. So if you don't see any, that's probably an indication that something's not quite right there. Something's being left out. And then lastly, we have very few withdrawals. That's very uncommon. Ordinarily in a clinical trial, you're going to have patients that withdraw for whatever reason. So if you see one where there are no withdrawals, or there are very few withdrawals, that could be a sign that something may not be quite up to snuff there. So what is the impact of fraud? Well, first of all, it's very costly for sponsors to investigate. It costs a lot of money to go and investigate these doctors, these investigators, to determine whether or not they're committing fraud. There's disciplinary action for investigators if they get caught. You can have publication retractions. You see those in the news all the time, where some study was done and they published the results in some prestigious journal, and then only to find out a little later that the results weren't quite as what they had originally reported. So you'll see publications retracting journal articles and research results. That's a fairly common thing. Then finally, you've got unworthy drugs that are being approved. So if you've got fraud going on out there, and you're getting drugs approved that are based on that fraud, then that's pretty bad. There was a story just recently where there were a multitude of drugs that were approved in India, and actually it turned out that a lot of the ECG data that was used to support the efficacy and safety conclusion turned out to be fabricated, and many of those medications were withdrawn. There were not any that were withdrawn from the U.S. market, but there were some that were drawn in other markets around the world. So it can have a very detrimental effect. So we all need to be kind of aware of this and be able to recognize some of the signs. Even if it's not out and out fraud, we want to be able to recognize when things just don't seem quite right. How can we prevent misconduct? The first thing we can do is provide training to the research staff. That would include the clinical sites and also the sponsors or CRO staff. Make sure they understand some of the signs of misconduct and be aware of it. We want to follow clear standard operating procedures and work instructions. When you work in our environment, either at a sponsor or CRO or even at a clinical site that's at an academic medical center, there'll be lots of standard operating procedures that you'll need to be aware of, and you'll need to be able to review, and that's going to govern how you operate at that particular location. And then we need to provide a mechanism for reporting potential misconduct. That can be something like, and maybe an anonymous 800 number you can call to report something that you don't think is completely accurate, or it could be some other mechanism for reporting misconduct. So we sometimes refer to the act of identifying scientific misconduct as whistleblowing, and you've heard of that. So the impact of whistleblowing would have some benefits. The benefits are to ensure that the scientific record is correct. That benefits not only science but our society at large. To comply with regulations, that's an individual impact. We want to have to prevent future misconduct. That benefits not only the scientific community but our society as well. And another impact, or another benefit rather, is to protect one's own reputation or the reputation of another. And then finally, to punish the wrongdoer. We really want people coming forward and identifying scientific misconduct when it occurs, because we want these people to be stopped and to hopefully be punished. So there are some risks that are associated with whistleblowing. First of all, the allegations may not be borne out. They may not be true. You've also got the time and effort and emotional intensive for not only the individual that is the whistleblower, but the person for which the allegations are leveled. You've also got the risk of retaliation by respondent or the respondent's institution. Sometimes that can occur. If you look at the situation over here at UNC Chapel Hill with the woman in the learning lab that was starting to blow the whistle on some of these fraudulent classes over there, she was actually dismissed from her job, and so you can have some retaliation as a result of that. Then finally, another risk is a person can gain the reputation as a troublemaker, and no one wants that. So there are some risks that are associated with identifying misconduct. So we talked about some of the risks or some of the impacts associated with whistleblowing. So how do we combat scientific misconduct? What are some of the things that we can do to sort of lessen its impact or help eliminate it? One thing we can do is eliminate the publish or perish paradigm that exists in a lot of academic institutions. Many of you are familiar with this. Faculty and other researchers, they need to publish on a regular basis, and many of them need to do that in order to maintain their professional standing. We need to protect whistleblowers, people that come forward and expose misconduct need to have some form of protection against some type of retaliation. And finally, we need to punish those who commit fraud. So what is scientific misconduct? It's gross negligence leading to scientific fabrication or false credit given to a scientist. It's also falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism that's associated with research results. These are some of the things that you'll probably encounter during your clinical research career, so you'll need to be aware of them. Then finally, results that cannot be attributable to honest error. We're going to see a video about Dr. Anil Poti a little bit later in our presentation, and this is one of the areas that he was discovered. He was reporting clinical trial results that could not be attributable to honest error. They couldn't be duplicated by people at another cancer center. So this is one of the ways in which he was found out, one of the ways he was exposed. So why do people commit scientific misconduct? They make mistakes and errors. There is a lot of competition for research grants, for money to conduct research, and so there's a lot of pressure to show results. Then finally, professional recognition. People in any profession want to be recognized for being a leader in that profession. So there's a lot of temptation to engage in scientific misconduct if it's going to potentially lead to professional recognition. So what are the consequences of scientific fraud? There can be disbarment, which means that an investigator would be barred from conducting research, say for the FDA or research that's sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. Some sponsors will not allow certain investigators to work on their clinical trials, so that's another example. You can also be imprisoned for engaging in scientific fraud, and you can have loss of research grants, not only for yourself but for the institution that you work at. What are some ways to avoid scientific misconduct? You can have accurate and complete source data. So in other words, data that can back up what the data is that you're reporting. But then also you can escalate appropriately instances that you think might lead to scientific misconduct. Let someone know, let your manager know, let someone in quality assurance know. There are a number of ways to do that. So what we're going to do next is to view a short segment from the news magazine show 60 Minutes that discusses the case of Dr. Anil Poti, who was a researcher at Duke. The video lasts about 14 minutes. I've included the link there to it, but also you'll find it on Blackboard, so you should be able to download that and view it. Like I say, it doesn't last very long, so that'll be the first thing that I want you to do. And then finally, for your Blackboard assignment, you've got two fairly short articles that I'd like for you to take a look at. The first is Uncovering Misconduct by Virginia Gwynn. Then also Scientific Misconduct from the Perspective of the Research Coordinator is the second article. So I'd like for you to read those. And then on the discussion board, post your response to the following question. Based on what you learned from the articles and in class, what should you be alert to with regard to scientific misconduct, and how should you best respond to it? So go ahead and post that in your own words on the discussion board, and see if you can get that up there, by the end of the week.